is dust.
Even through his ancient vox grill, the sound of his voice was less than a whisper, like that of wind scraping dust from a mountainside. He didn't mean to speak. He didn't mean anything. His mind felt as though it were floating in a deep black sea, every sense caught in a deep mire. Eons passed before there came an urge, a pulsing sense forward. And so his distant legs went. The tread beneath his feet barely a tickle, the sound a steady thump a million miles away. He saw in glimpses a hulking ship firing a salvo, lightning in a warp-torn sky, sand kicked up beneath the tread of hundreds of inhuman forms. His thoughts grasped onto the only thing that never left, the sound of ceramite boots hitting ground. A steady thump, thump, thump. Often he would try to count the steps, but when focus came enough to remember how, the sound would die away. Only after his focus drifted would the heavy rhythm rise again, as if to taunt what shreds of his mind he had been able to hold on to. Then at once the sound was replaced by something familiar, a staccato burst that was the tempo of his life for centuries, the bark of bolterfire.
Hey guys, I'm Spencer. Today we're going to be painting up and listening to a little story about this here Rubric Marine. As you heard before, that is a beginning part of a little short story that I wrote about this Rubric Marine, read by the wonderful Sean Anthony, who you can find links to his channel in the description. First, I start by mixing up a little bit of green stuff. I wanted to make this Rubric Marine a little distinct. I really like when all my models have just a little bit of uniqueness to each one of them. So I'll do a little bit of green sculpting. Here you can see me having a horrid attempt of trying to flatten it out. My idea was to have, at first it was one large piece of cloth. Inevitably, I ended up not really liking that. So you see me here just start sizing it up and feeling out how big I want these pieces to be. Eventually, I hone in on a size I like, and so I just start cutting these little triangles. I'll cut the tips off the triangles so they end up being like a tapered rectangle, which is kind of the aesthetic choice I'm going for. I took a lot of inspiration from games like Assassin's Creed Origins and just other general fantasy-esque Egyptian. So in a lot of that, they seem to have these tapered cloth pieces all over. I wanted to bring more of that ancient Egyptian flavor into this model. So you see me here, I get them down the size I like, pop a little super glue on them, and then it's just gluing them into space. I also don't use enough water on my fingers, so you'll see me have to use the X-Acto blade to pull it off. And then I just rinse and repeat this process for all the other pieces of the garment. Now these are going to end up looking pretty flat because they're just kind of pressed into place, flat little pieces of green stuff. So I take out my silicone sculpting tools and just start pushing and pulling these until they get that more draped cloth. I end up putting the arm onto the model with a little poster putty just so I can get a better feel of how these should drape in the model's pose. Once it dries, these felt a little flat and rounded around the edges in a way I didn't want the cloth to, so I just kind of trim them with my plastic clippers and my X-Acto knife. Then it's on to battle damage, which is my favorite part of putting a model together, which is just slamming home with a pin vise and an X-Acto knife, and just I start mangling this dude up, cutting holes and scratches. And usually I don't go pretty deep, but on a few of these holes, I went very, very deep because the lore is that they don't really have a body inside them, Rubric Marines, so I thought it'd be cool to just get some really deep holes in there. I want all of my models to feel like they've been really seeing battle. And this one specifically, because it's a Rubric Marine and not a living, breathing dude inside, just soul dust, I thought it would be really cool to just have him looking like he's just been beat up for the last couple thousand years. And if the cloth looks a little too pristine and you really mess up armor with a lot of battle damage, it's a little jarring. So I just came back and started really cutting some large holes and tears into that cloth. Anyway, that's really all I did for this model on the sculpting side. So here's a little more story.
At once, the murky sea he found his consciousness in was bubbling and boiling. Thoughts began careening through his mind as he heard solid rounds ricocheting off his battle plate. The dark was clearing. He could see, and he was moved with purpose again. His own purpose. He could feel the weight of his bolter, no, his flamer, in his palms. He looked down at it, and he saw his hands, a deep metallic crimson. The ground behind them was strewn with gore and the wet viscera of battle. When his gaze trailed beyond his barrel to the harsh sky, he saw silhouettes of humans being blown apart by his brother's bolter rounds. His brothers! Certainly they would know what was going on. Why could he not think? Why was he killing? If only he could remember their names. If only he could remember his own. He could speak into the Vox. All the while, still on he pushed, steadily forward with other legionnaires. But his name. What was his name? Ophirin? No, that didn't feel right. The crowd of enemy silhouettes in front of him was thinning, falling into chunky heaps as they died. Light began to pierce the sea his mind had been drowned in. Alferian? No, that did not bite into the meat of his brain the way his own name should. He was now where he thought he would meet the crowd head-on, but instead of the clash of blade and fist, all he could feel was the ground get soft beneath his tread. The light was growing, his mind swimming to the surface of its confinement. His consciousness pushed the gossamer film that kept him. He could feel its seams beginning to tear. Wait! His name was...
Alright, y'all, so now on to painting. So I start with a Chaos Black primer, and I just start laying on some very washy layers of Cantor Blue mixed in with Genestealer Purple. One of my favorite lines from any of the books I've read is from the Black Legion book by Arendensky Bowden, where Kaon talks about how no matter how much they paint over or even use Warp Flame to scorch the paint off of the new Rubric Marines, there's always just this color of corruption brewing beneath the surface, and I thought that'd be a really cool thing to capture. My attempt at that was to just mix in different purples and greens as an underlayer, and then eventually I'm going to go back and I'm going to glaze over these with that more traditional Thousand Suns blue. But you can see here is me using Cantor Blue and Genestealer Purple, and I just glaze that all over, just reducing it down with water, thin layers, making these kind of swirly motions. Eventually I start using a little bit of the AK line white and mixing that in with the purple. Here you can see me just using straight moot green. Then eventually I get to a place I like, and I start glazing over with just some dark blue ink. And this will fill in the recesses, give me some shadows. I start peeling back some of that while it's still wet with a dry sponge, just to make sure that this underlayer still shows through. And then Thousand Suns blue, I just start using that real watered down, real super thin layers. So that way the underlayer still shows through, but you're getting mostly the top layer. And eventually, again, I start mixing in more of that AK white and giving some volumetric highlights until eventually I get a pretty solid chunky volumetric highlight with a lot of that AK white into the Thousand Suns blue, which makes it pretty opaque. But when later we come back and we do all the grime, it will darken down. Then the fun of any Chaos Space Marine is the trim. I start here with Rune Lord Brass and just start going about highlighting all the trim. The age-old saying of using the side of your brush here is, as standard, a lifesaver and really helps with making sure that you don't overpaint on any of this trim. I am a fan of trim. I find this process a whole hell of a lot of fun, especially seeing it pull together all these different color layers you have underneath. Then to give the metallic trim a little more dynamic color depth, I use the 2 Thin Coats range Dragon's Gold and just start laying that on top like I would a volumetric highlight of regular paint. It's a much more saturated gold color, and this gives it a little more depth. Then we come to the tabard, and here I do a slight mix of Abaddon Black into Wraithbone, and then come back a little bit later and just highlight some of that with straight Wraithbone. Here you can see me going over the metallics with Reichland Flesh Shade. Again, this shade will give them just a little bit more depth, and then I go over all of the armor creases with a very thin down wash of Abaddon Black. I'm not a huge fan of a Nuln Oil. I prefer the control I get by just watering down Abaddon Black a lot. And then it's rinse and repeat these steps on all the pieces that aren't the body. The arms and the head and the gun. You'll see here I try to keep it very, very loose just as before, because the fun of this is just slapping paint around, not really being super precise. You don't really need to be, especially with these early color layers. When it gets to trim, it gets a little more steady-handed. But here is just about having fun, seeing what swirls you can make. Again, I do the same thing for the cloth, and for the gun, I paint some parts with Cantor Blue. I tried off camera to do a little bit of like a glowing thing with the runes, but I didn't end up liking it, so I just do a really heavy overbrush of Lead Belcher. And then again, do the same trim with the whole thing getting some Rune Lord Brass, and then when the model is properly trimmed up, I will some volumetric highlights with the Dragon's Gold. Then we move on to transfers. Sometimes I'll freehand, but the CSM come with a pretty nice transfer sheet. I just picked out a logo I liked, and then this little eyeball. I throw on a pretty chunky coat of acrylic gloss medium because I find it sticks very well. I move it into place and then lock it in with a damp sponge. Do the same thing on the other arm with the other small insignia. And then since I have so many cuts out, I actually have to go in with my X-Acto knife and cut out in all these bullet holes where it would go. I throw on a coat of Lamian Medium to just bring everything into the same sheen. And then I do a damage pass with Thousand Suns Blue, just so these don't look so brand new. I Reichland Flesh Shade all my cloth, both on the arms and the armor. And again, throw that into the crevices of the trim. Then again, thin down Abaddon Blackwash, and here you can see how much that just brings out the depth of some of these pieces. I actually go back over here with the Wraithbone, do some highlights, and then it's damage pass with Lead Belcher. I just start dappling that all over. For the eyes on this model that are like all over, I wanted to go with a purple color so they don't stand out too much, but they have a nice highlight. Same for the eye lenses. First I throw in straight Gene Stealer purple, and then again mixing in a little bit of that AK white to just start doing some subtle highlights. Give them some depth to their forms. Then it's time for the glue up. Start with the arms and the head, and put those all into place for the pose I like. And then you have a whole model. Then, my favorite part, a little Typhus Corrosion. This is my favorite paint to use, and it adds a really, really nice grimdark style, especially when you start adding in all the little holes and stuff. So, I throw that all over. Then for the base, I just take a nice piece of cork, super glue it down. I love cork board. And then I start picking at it with a tweezer till I like it. Then I use acrylic gesso, which is acrylic white paint mixed in with some marble dust, I believe. And it just, on top of the cork, adds a nice rocky texture. You could use a texture paste, but this is just what I prefer to use. I like the look of. And then I use Martian iron earth around the rest of the base to give it that crackly desert look. I really wanted to lean into the all this dust kind of aspect of this model, and so I thought a pretty traditional desert base would look pretty good. Once the Martian iron earth is done, you lock it in with a little watered down PVA glue. I use just an old brush here. You could use like an eyedropper. That makes sure that this isn't going anywhere. And for the base, I didn't have any Xandri dust or any nice tans on me, so it's a mix of Ketachan flesh tone and a Wraithbone, and then just a little bit of Flash Kids yellow if I felt like it needed some more saturation. I do that dry brush all over the base, and then I actually dry brush a little bit onto the feet and shoulders of the model just to make it feel like he's in this environment. Once that dry brush is nice and full, I'll come back over with a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade just to bring out some of those cracks and details. And then mixing in some more Wraithbone, I do a final just highlight dry brush just to give it that little bit of depth. Then I hit the rim with a little black paint just to clean up the edges. And then lastly comes the glue up. A little glue on the feet, a little glue on the base, and put them into place. Oh, and one last little step I like is I will take the highlight color of the base and just kind of dry brush it on a little bit onto the feet just so it feels like he's in his place on the world. Anyway, here's the last little bit of the story. Thanks for joining.
An ear-splitting thud and the shrieking of 1,000 splinters inside a hollow shell interrupted his focus. He looked down and saw a bolt shell had pierced his breastplate, its explosive contents loosened inside him. But he felt nothing. His gaze tracked up and he saw his hands again, this time not crimson but a deep and vibrant blue. A blue that just beneath the surface swirled unnaturally with pink and green corruption. He saw his flamer, and at its barrel's end he saw the human, legs missing, bleeding profusely, and holding a bolt pistol pointed towards where the puncture wound had been made. He let loose his flamer's contents and watched as the human form writhed and morphed into a smoldering ash. Then, silence. His companions stood statuesque. What was he just thinking about? Their names? No. His name? No. Where was he? Where is he? The murk around his consciousness began to darken. Something heavy had tied itself to his mind and was sinking him back into the darkness he had tried so hard to climb from. Sight began to fade. He was floating in an ocean of nothing. He tried to scream, a final act of rage and defiance, but all that could be heard was the faint gasping out of his Vox grill.
Who is dust?
Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed watching me put together this model as much as I enjoyed painting and putting it together. I also hope you liked that short story I wrote, and Sean Antony did an amazing job with the voiceover, so please, if you enjoyed this, give him a little love. Some of his stuff is linked in the description, and I may do more of these, I may not, I don't know, but thanks for checking it out.